Good morning. Thank you for joining us for the monthly webinar sponsored by the Health Data Exploration Project, or the HDE. My name is Cinnamon Bloss. I'm an investigator in the HDE and a faculty member here at UC San Diego. The Health Data Exploration Project, as many of you may know, is a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation-funded project based here at the California Institute for Telecommunications and Information Technology here at UCSD. The HDE is a project led by faculty here, but that involves a multidisciplinary group of investigators and industry leaders in many different areas, including data science, medicine, engineering, ethics, and other areas. We have a network that we are trying to grow as part of the HDE, and I would encourage all of you who are joining us today to go to our website and join our network. So I'm going to just want to move right into today's topic. And I'm going to let our speakers introduce themselves. I'm really looking forward to the presentation this morning. The title of the webinar is From Self-Monitoring to Self-Experimentation, Behavior Change in Patients with Multiple Sclerosis. And actually, this project comes out of an Agile grant that was funded within our own project to investigators who pursued this research. And I'm going to go ahead and let them take it away. Eric, do you want to start?
All right, Emil, why don't you start, and then I can get into the more of the self-experimentation.
Well, everybody should introduce themselves first.
Oh, okay. So hi, I'm Dr. Eric Hekler. I'm an assistant professor at Arizona State University, and clinical psychologist by training. I do a lot of work on using digital health technologies for behavior change.
Emil Chiauzzi. I'm the research director at Patients Like Me, which is an online patient research network in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I oversee our grant and commercial research here, and I have a particular interest in behavioral health and also the use of wearables for chronic disease.
Hi, Pranabhesh Das Mahapatra, research scientist at Patients Like Me. I work on a lot of the health, data analytics on the wearable design studies, and this particular project is something that I've been quite involved in.
Great, and just real quick, I actually forgot to prompt Alex to introduce herself as well.
Hi, I'm Alex Hubenko. I'm a program manager at the Qualcomm Institute Cal IT 2 at UCSD, and I've been overseeing all of the different Agile projects. Some of the webinars you've heard already, and some will be upcoming over the next few months.
Yeah, and this is actually our very first webinar that will focus on findings from one of our Agile projects. So it's a very kind of a milestone for us. I'll let you guys take it away.
Okay, Eric.
No, Emil, please.
Okay. This is a project based on the use of wearables by MS patients, multiple sclerosis patients. Patients Like Me has begun working in this area because we have a very large population. We have about 40,000 patients who have various types of MS on the platform. And last year, we decided to get involved with the use of consumer wearables in this population, and we wanted to see some very basic things. We wanted to check on the use of wearables, if there was interest in that, if people could integrate these wearables into their lives, if they saw any value in managing their health when they use them. So we did a large study. We had 250 people, and to give you a sense of the size of our population, we recruited those people in one day. So we did a pilot project. This was with Biogen, and we had a large group of people who continued to stay involved with the use of these wearables, and they stayed authenticated on our site because our site can accept the data. And this was a Fitbit 1 that they've been using. So when we got involved with the Health Data Exploration Group, we thought it would be interesting to investigate what has been going on with people since they've been using these devices. A lot of the wearable studies are not long-term studies. They tend to be fairly short and pilot-like. So we thought it would be good to check in with them. And then we met Eric, who has developed a very interesting model of self-experimentation. And we kind of married these ideas to develop a brief course that we could try out with people and see if they could learn how to integrate these wearables into their daily functioning. So we constructed a two-part project. We'll briefly go through this. We enlisted the aid of Eric and his group in helping to design the course that people completed. So we'll share with you the qualitative results, and Pranabhesh will review the quantitative results, and then just some of our observations about what it was like to conduct an Agile study. It's a new concept to a clinical psychologist. It's not something that anybody taught me about. So I did learn a few things, and I think the rest of us did. So we'll share some of that also.
Great.
Great. And so I guess I can just fill in a little bit more of that background on the side of the self-experimentation work. So as Emil already set up, we were really interested in my lab. One of the things that we've been trying to work forward on is trying to figure out how do we design very highly personalized and precise interventions for behavior change. And so on the one side, we have a lot of work where we're really trying to basically make decisions for people, so more or less, in essence, keeping track of things with wearables and whatnot, and then providing, quote, just-in-time adaptive intervention feedback to people just while they go. But in some sense, so that's doing a lot of work where the system is really keeping track of what's going on in your life and then making decisions, giving you recommendations like how many steps should you shoot for in a given day, and how many points should we give you if you do that, right? But conceptually, I'm actually much more excited with what we're doing. Well, not more excited, but I'm very excited about philosophically what we're doing here with self-experimentation. Another side of the lab for these highly precise interventions is to basically figure out how do we teach people how to experiment for themselves. And so the idea is how do we give them a structure, give them an idea of like what does it mean to change your own behavior, what are some basic strategies to do that, how do you kind of come up with a hypothesis on how you can change your own health behavior, and then how do you test that using 1 week to the next. And so we were actually funded by Google to kind of work on developing a self-experimentation strategy, which we've been iteratively developing. We've got a few different iterations. We just actually finished gathering all of our data for our first kind of full trial examining the concept in detail. But long story short, with that's then when Emil and I met, we then had a fun conversation, and we thought that this would be fun to marry these two things together. Particularly, kind of it seemed like there was an interesting opportunity for MS patients on self-experimentation because it's such a dynamic problem going on, and I'm sure Emil will go into a lot more detail about this, but one of the things that we really found really interesting was this sort of question of, well, with MS patients, sometimes they can push themselves too far when they're too physically active, and then they kind of flare up their symptoms, but if they don't push themselves enough, then they start getting more of a long-term detrimental impact, and so there's sort of like this need for a sweet spot, if you will, for physical activity levels. And so we thought with wearable sensors and whatnot, one of the things that we wanted to do is try to give people a structure of self-experimentation where they could basically find their own sweet spot for any given day, recognizing that might change one day to the next. And so I'll give this back to Emil in a second, but the thing that I found really exciting about this particular Agile project was sort of this very pragmatic need to help people dynamically think through what's going on in their lives and having a strategy of experimentation on themselves where they can see, oh, when my pain's this high, maybe I need to reduce my steps this much. It was a very fun and I think very neat way to kind of explore this problem space. So that's that. Emil, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Bear with me while I switch to a PowerPoint here. We're going to go through a series of slides. So let's see. Okay, can everybody see that okay? Okay, so we have been working with MS for a while. It's as you probably know, it's a very difficult condition. It fluctuates. People experience pain and stiffness and limitations in their quality of life. And one of the prescriptions for managing the disease is to try and stay active. And we thought, when you have the availability of activity monitors, would that help people be able to monitor themselves and regulate their activity? Unfortunately, the way many wearables are set up is simply as a measurement tool. There is some feedback of data. There is some rudimentary behavior change involved. But because it's focused primarily, many of these devices, Fitbit and whatever, are focused on a group of people who are in wellness and athletic activity, the devices may not adapt well to people who are trying to manage a chronic disease. And so that's an area that we wanted to learn about. And because we believe that pretty much everyone conducts experiments on themselves every day in terms of how they regulate their behavior, we thought there was an opportunity to introduce this into that kind of self-experimentation approach. The nice thing about consumer wearables is, the form factors are generally more favorable than some of the research-grade monitors. You'd probably trade off a little bit of accuracy. But many of these device makers developed attractive and usable interfaces. And because of the philosophy of patients like me, where we are very interested in engaging the patient and feeding data back to them, it's important for us to consider these consumer devices because a lot of the research-grade devices do not do a good job of that. Another piece to consider is that we want to think about some of the behavior change, behavior mod kinds of approaches that many of us know from our own education and providing treatment, and see if we can introduce that into the use of wearables. Actually, let me, okay, that's a little bit better. So we developed this study working with Eric, and we had a couple of basic questions. Under free living conditions, so letting people to their own devices, so to speak, how do people utilize these devices? And we had a ready group available from that study I mentioned earlier, and we decided that we could recruit from this group and learn about how people had been using these devices for almost a year. The other piece was if we build out this course and try to find out more about the use of this data in a dynamic way, could people learn more about themselves and integrate personal rules into how they self-managed their MS? There were two phases. The first phase was a qualitative study where we interviewed people. And again, this is a very small number of people. We ended up interviewing 7 people, 6 females and 1 male. And then there was a phase 2 pilot study where we introduced the course, and we had a dozen people go through that over a period of a month, and I'll describe that a little bit more to you. So we interviewed people, and there's some data in the literature about how wearable use or activity monitor use specifically is utilized by people with chronic disease. My guess is a lot of what I'm about to say applies to other chronic diseases, but this is what we heard from people with MS. First of all, we all know about the 10,000 step goal, and going to be very difficult for most people with MS to manage that kind of activity level on a regular basis. This is pushed heavily in the use of these consumer monitors, and for many people it's simply not realistic. When we asked people about their use over the past year, we were getting numbers like 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 as kind of an average activity level. So it's really important to think about adapting those kinds of standards. And my guess is those standards are going to vary greatly between different chronic diseases. Another aspect is that because people have chronic diseases, they work at slower walking speeds. A number of devices are not good at measuring steps, for instance. So that needs to be considered. And many people who are coping with chronic diseases are not only looking at activities that activity monitors are good at, but they're trying to diversify. They're doing yoga, they're doing swimming, that sort of thing. And when we give people feedback about their activity level, sometimes it will not give them credit for those sorts of activities. So we need to have a broad view about activities and how people set up their lives to do these different things.
Hey, Emil?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. We're just noticing that there's an issue with your slides advancing.
I'm on a slide that says wearable considerations.
That's not what we're seeing.
Oh, what are you seeing?
Emil, I think you shared the wrong screen. I'm guessing you might have two monitors.
There it is. There. Now we see wearable considerations. Yeah.
The full screen that's messing it up.
Yeah, the full screen I think was messing it up. I'll just leave it here. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. Because people are experiencing a lot of fluctuations, we can't necessarily say that more is better and that the next day is going to be a more active day than today was. Another aspect, particularly with a disease like MS, is environmental. Because heat often creates a lot of difficulties. It really limits people, and they have to be mindful of that and be very active in trying to find alternatives when they are dealing with hot weather, for instance. We have to build it into a broader disease self-management plan. People are already attempting to use behavior change techniques. They wouldn't call it that. I'll show you some examples of what people told us. But how can we leverage what people are learning about themselves in developing these behavioral plans? And how can we introduce other people into those? We heard from a lot of people. I put on my Fitbit. My husband's got a Fitbit. We go for a walk. Sometimes there's a little competitive thing going on there. But generally, they're really utilizing social support in keeping their activities going. The metrics. People rely on simple metrics like steps. We found that they often underutilize sleep and calories and distance and some of the other kinds of features that they can track. Some of those may be more helpful in some cases. So we need to learn more about the importance of these different metrics for a particular disease and how people can leverage those. And finally, one of the key things that you see in the way these wearables are marketed is there's kind of a competitive athletic aspect to what people are expecting from this usage. And we found that our patients were not very interested in the social competitive aspects. They're certainly interested in social aspects. Can we meet up and take a walk? But they're less interested in the competitive aspects. And I'll show you an ad that I think it only recently came out. This is with Garmin, and it's their new Vivo, I think it's called Vivo Smart HR. The saying here is beat yesterday. This is not a philosophy that we want to promote in terms of chronic disease management. So when we ask people about what sorts of behavioral tricks, some people here, patients like me, call them health hacks. Are you utilizing? We found that you can look at people's everyday behavior and find behavior change techniques there. People were doing a lot of planning and trying to modulate their activity with rest versus more taxing activity. They were shifting their schedules around, particularly as it related to temperature, if they were living in those types of areas. They were moving around a lot in terms of how they did activity. One of the things that people told us is that when they couldn't work outside, they would find large internal spaces, and they'd go for a walk around a Costco or that sort of thing. And then pacing. People really found ways of trying to pick up on when things were getting worse, and the big symptoms were pain and stiffness, and fatigue is very important. So we wanted to capitalize on some of these activities and some of the knowledge that people have learned, and with Eric's help, we built out a 101 course. It was fairly low tech. We put a PowerPoint together, and we recruited a set of people who we had an interview group, and then we had the group that did the testing. So these were separate groups, both recruited from that original large group from last year. And we had a 1-month study where we conducted 3 separate sessions. We had a person work with the participants over the phone, and they conducted these 3 sessions. The first session was basically to identify a sweet spot, which is the maximal level that you can do stepwise. We focused on steps because that was the easiest, without overtaxing yourself, where you would have to recover the next day. And then we asked people to track their steps using their Fitbits for 1 week, look at the symptoms that were most troublesome, rate their daily status on something called Instant Me, which is basically a 5-point rating scale of how you're doing that day. It's on the Patients Like Me website. And try to determine a relationship between their activity, the steps, and the rating. And to do that for a week. We had a second session where we reviewed that data. We had them pick one of those symptoms and then try to determine a sweet spot. So somebody might say, when I'm feeling really horrible and I do 6,000 steps, that is no good. On a day like that, I have to do 3,000. But when I'm feeling really good, I can do the 6,000. So we worked with them to kind of determine a range and a relationship between a particular rating and a level of stepping in a particular day. So I might say, if my Instant Me is really bad, I will do 3,000 steps. If it's really good, I'll do 6,000. If it's in the middle, I'll do 4,500. And what we did was try to establish a range around each of those where we could determine that there was a match. So their goal was to match those levels each day depending on how they felt. So the goal wasn't how many steps can I do, it was how many matches can I get. We had them build in self-rewards for meeting goals and establish rules for performing these activities. You see a couple of examples there. So if I'm feeling good and I want to do more activity, when my kids come home, I'll go for a walk. If I need to be careful about overdoing it and I see some household tasks, I'll hold back on those and bank some steps for the end of the day. So we had them do that for 2 weeks. They'd get up in the morning, do an Instant Me. How am I doing today? Okay. I'm not doing too well. This is the level of stepping I'm going to do. And then rate that at the end of the day and see how well they felt and determine how well they performed a match on a given day. And then they did that for a couple of weeks. We had them on the phone again for a third session. We reviewed the data with them. They were always able to see their data online. And then asked them about their experience of the course and what they would recommend for course changes. So as far as the qualitative results, we had a really good reaction. We had some people drop out. A few people had Fitbit problems, losing it, mechanical problems, that sort of thing. One person was feeling very poorly and dropped out. One person wasn't feeling very symptomatic and dropped out. So we ended up with 12 people. And overall, of the group who got through it, and these people, went through all the steps of the course, they felt that their experience was very good. You can see some examples of their comments there. We really saw that in a number of people, they were able to start making connections and start really thinking about modulating, whereas before it was just, I'm just going to go out and walk and, the chips fall where they may. So, we felt like they had a good sense of the importance of the matching, and they were reporting that they felt a little, more tuned in on, how their body was functioning, how they can pace themselves, what they could do to improve symptoms, how they could motivate themselves, and the relationship between the symptoms and the activities. So that's something we really wanted to get across. So overall, qualitatively, we felt like we were on the right track. Where it kind of got derailed a little bit was in terms of the matching and some of the quantitative data, and I'm going to have Pranabesh go through that right now.
So in terms of the quantitative results, we did a couple of things to look at the sweet spot, the adherence to the sweet spot as well. So what we created was we had the measurements of these participants before the course and then measurements after the course. And we looked at sort of the coefficient of variation from the mean within each day for each of these participants. And we also looked at adherence, meaning how many people stuck to the sweet spot within the study duration of 2 weeks. So there was a bit of, given the measurement error, we sort of created an arbitrary cut point of 20% plus minus. So anyone within, so for example, anyone mentioning 5,000 as a goal for the day with a 20% plus minus fit in that sort of adherence category. The results were mixed. We had, we've noted adherence ranging from 10%, meaning, basically adhering to 1 day or 2 days in the 2 week period, to 86%, which is like a nearly complete adherence to the goals. What I have highlighted here are sort of 3 case examples, which are sort of in bold font. One is individual 2. So if we look at before and after the course for individual 2, this is highly adherent individual, someone who has very little variability in step counts, pretty high adherence as well, both before and after the course. There's obviously this Hawthorne effect in the after course period because people are being observed, so we see some of the step counts and some of the activity levels slightly higher during that period. But generally, I think participant 2 would fall into the category of someone who's highly adherent, has a sort of flat line in terms of the trajectory of number of steps or daily activities, so has a pretty stable profile. If we look at participant 6, that's an interesting observation. Just by looking at the graph, it looks like, that's sort of 6 on the figure to the left. It looks like it's pretty sort of neatly tied in. The range is not that broad, but what we have to also be mindful is, a change from, say, for example, 200 steps to 500 steps is a lot of variation. So it's probably someone who is sort of in the lower activity zone. So someone who's in the lower activity zone had a great variability, had a high variability in measurements, and also poor adherence as well. The other example I have is participant 9. This is an individual who had a mean step count of, of 4,000 plus, which is sort of in the mean zone for MS patients that we have seen in our population, and still a pretty high variability, low adherence. So in general, I mean, it was sort of a mixed bag. Some people stuck to the sweet spot. Some people weren't able to. Some of the qualitative results gleaned into that. There's just so much daily variation in activity that it can sometimes happen that people can set themselves a goal and not be able to accomplish that. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. This is sort of more of a general challenges, general measurement challenges and ways we can sort of address that. Some of that are things that we actually do in our population and in this study particularly, and some of those are sort of more device-related measurement related to the measurement properties. So on the top bucket, what I have is just some general challenges of capturing free living behavior. So the thing that I was actually talking to Emil about today, it's not like tagging a shark where you could put a tag and the shark swims along anywhere and you can have the right measurement. It's very much real world. It's very much free living. There are a lot of infrequent and sporadic use. The goal setting aspect that Emil talked about, that's quite variable. That is sort of related to just the free living environment of individuals. Possible solutions, something that we actually did in this study is continuous engagement programs, portability, aesthetics, usability, using devices that are pretty, that have a good usability aspect to it as well. And on the second piece of it is actually the device properties. A lot of studies, there's one that that I came across today from Matthews et al., refer to the validity and reliability, to the accuracy, to the different activities that can have an impact on measurement. So for example, walking speed, playing the drums, driving, and then adherence to instructions. Generally, these things can be allayed by technological improvements, having more training videos, engagement programs, and things like that. So engagement program is definitely an area that we emphasize a lot when we do these studies of free living behavior. And so finally, this is actually a case study of the prelude to this study, the one that we'd mentioned earlier, 248 members recruited within 24 hours, and we were able to sort of look at adherence as well as the device measured activity. So this has a pretty nice tie-in to subjective and objective data. So what we have actually dissected here is basically looking at symptom and disability from a span of no symptom to no disability to total disability, and we looked at sort of step count just as plots based on where that individual fits in terms of the disease severity. And this is a pretty nice looking graph of reduced activity based on greater disability, which is something that we would expect naturally, but something that's not always easy to measure given the adherence compliance issues and measuring sort of free living behavior as such. So that brings me to the end of the discussion on the data aspects of it. I'm just wondering, are there any questions on this?
I thought that was great. Thank you.
Okay, this is Emil again. I'll move in for just another couple of slides, and then Eric, please jump in anytime you like. One of the questions that came up during the course of doing this is how well does this type of study follow kind of an agile method, that might be used by developers, and this was my first experience with it. I think I might have done this a little differently based on that model. We asked patients, how would you do this differently? we had a very short baseline period, and as Pronabesh was saying, there's a lot of variability. One of the key issues in doing wearable studies is how to detect the signal from the noise, and figuring out, what are the factors that are operating, during any given observation. Because it could be everything from not putting the device on to heat, to lack of motivation, to needing to attend to children, whatever it is. So it's hard to understand sometimes what a lower or higher level of activity may represent. So we would recommend that when people do these studies, you certainly have a good size baseline period so that you could, follow trend in terms of the activity level. I think we would experiment more with the rules and try to understand how this matching works and what might motivate people to match more. I think we had an idea about it when we went in, but it's a very tricky concept to figure out what represents a match and how do the patients look at that concept. I would want to experiment more with that. Showed a slide on the relationship between an activity measurement and a level of disability. I think it would be very interesting to look at the various metrics that these devices provide and see how that gets played out in terms of activity, and if we can find relationships there. I mentioned the matching, and I think that one of the things that people were saying was, even within a day, there's a lot of variability. So they might, we're all like this. We get up in the morning, you feel one way, and then could we realistically judge our day based on how we felt getting up in the morning? That might be a little risky for some of us. Some of us have a harder time, getting moving, for instance. So they were saying, it kept fluctuating during the day. How do you characterize the day? Because this is what drives the match. So that's something we need to learn more about. And finally, more experimentation with various behavior change techniques, particularly the ones that people have discovered on their own. I think would be very interesting. But I think that the Agile approach is definitely an interesting way to do this kind of behavioral research. And I think if I were to do it again, I would implement some of these ideas. And then finally, where we're going next is we are completing a publication with Eric now, and we hope to submit that fairly soon. Eric is at work on a presentation for a conference. He can tell you more about that in a second. And we are interested in considering, the potential for future grant proposals. And we now have a year of data from almost 50 patients using the Fitbit. We want to dig into that and learn more about who stays with it, what sorts of patterns of usage are there, how do those patterns of usage correlate with subtypes of MS, and we'd be more than willing to share those things with the network. So that's basically what I have to say. I'll unshare this thing. And if anyone has any questions, or please, Eric, if you want to comment on any of this, be my guest.
Maybe I'll just quickly jump in on the Agile project idea, particularly. So that's a concept that I've been playing around with. I've been affectionately calling the concepts Agile science, and one part of that is riffing on the idea of, within the Agile software development, very common practice nowadays for developing software, there's this idea of a sprint, where in essence, usually it's 1 to 2 weeks. You basically try to figure out what's a really important assumption you're making about building a technology, and then how do you build some, quote, minimal viable product to get it out in the world and test it. And so as a concept, that was something that I've been really intrigued with, to try to think about for early pilot work. So so I'm excited to see this, that we've moved forward with this in the HDE projects. And in particular, I'm also, for me, that I think this has been a great learning case in terms of just exploring what you can learn fast, you know, and in particular, kind of recognizing these early stage work. It's really trying to ask the question of, am I on the right track? Is this something that I should invest more resources in? And I think with relatively limited resources, we actually learned, I think, a fair amount pretty quickly with it, getting us into a pretty good starting place for, you know, all the points that Emil highlighted. Right? It's kind of setting up. We got qualitative information suggesting that we've got something interesting here. We also learned the difficulties with actually measuring quantitatively, you know, what is a sweet spot. But I mean, but overall, it seems like there is, you know, we seem to have enough data to say, yeah, it seems like we're exploring something interesting, and we could answer that relatively quickly. So that's pretty, I think, exciting conceptually, because I think a lot of times people tend to design something to be a perfect intervention for how they perceive it to work in the world, and then never get that feedback from those individuals. So when they actually get out there, the individuals often respond with, well, that's not what I had in mind, or that's not really helpful for me. So to me, I was very excited about where we got with this, particularly the importance that, you know, the patients did seem to really qualitatively enjoy the idea and the concept, and that, to me, that's the most important starting point for, you know, further exploration.
Okay, thanks. So we've gotten some questions from participants, and I'll just read them off, and then you guys can decide who's best to answer them. So the first question is, how much of the sporadic use that you've highlighted do you think might be due to using an older version of the Fitbit in your study?
Take that?
Yeah, I can take that. That's a tricky question. The short answer is we don't know. I think if we do a newer version, that might affect that. But I want to emphasize one thing. This group that we had actually targeted for the particular study, they had been on, you know, they've been on continuous use of Fitbit without any sort of direct targeted outreach. So, you know, to sort of boil it down, you know, we did an earlier study over a year back, and they were sort of continued users. So I think the sporadic use is not so much related to using an earlier version. This is purely speculative. You don't have data to support that. So that may be, you know, partially because of just, you know, some of the rigors of daily activity. That's what I would guess, you know, because people might not sort of clip on their devices every day. Some organizations, some groups have actually advocated of taking device data from patients or individuals who are using it for at least 10 hours in the total day as a measurement, you know, as a measure of sort of use of sporadic versus, you know, non-use and all that. So I think, long story short, it's actually hard to parse that out. I personally don't think it is related to an older version, just because, you know, these people were already in our study and they were using it on a continuous basis, which is why we sort of outreach to this group.
So as a follow-on to that, oh, sorry, did you have something to add, Emil?
Oh, no, we're fine.
There was a question, are there any risks associated with wearing a Fitbit all the time, for example, radiation?
I don't know about radiation. Maybe Eric knows, I don't know.
I mean, it's a very low battery. I mean, it would be just about as, you know, it's sending a Bluetooth signal, so there might be some small risk, but I don't know anything about that. I would be skeptical, but I am not knowledgeable.
I can comment on one risk, and I will show you. This is a Fitbit Surge, and due to the rubber in the strap, some people get rashes.
That for sure happens.
I have gotten rashes from this. There are times when I have to take it off, adding noise to my data. And I actually am kind of lucky. I looked at some of what other people were experiencing on the web. I looked at some images, and it wasn't pretty. I don't know how many people that happens to. I will tell you that there are dermatologists on the Fitbit site commenting on this. So.
And actually, one of the reasons we use Fitbit 1 in MS population, a band-based Fitbit Zip, for example, which was sort of in the market quite quite well, was not used is because of spasticity that MS patients actually get from using something like that, and sort of its effect on heat and temperature and all that. So that's why we chose a clip-on to allay that.
I think with the Fitbit 1, to capture sleep, you have to take it out.
Yes.
Sleep. And some people didn't like doing that. That
right, because it's a bit. It takes some amount of manipulation to actually put it in the sleeve, in and out of the sleeve, and it's even difficult for you with normal sort of motor skills. Yeah, I think some people.
Okay, next question. Is there some advice you would give designers at Fitbit or other companies who make wearables about how to think about the goal-setting features in their systems, and what would make them more useful or appropriate for a wider set of users?
One thing, and I know Eric will probably have a comment on this, but one thing that I would definitely leverage is user input and what users do to motivate themselves. And we think that the way we approach things here is, we think there's a lot of wisdom in how patients approach their disease. I would certainly look at what works for the people who set goals successfully, and how they maintain those. Eric, I'm sure you have a comment on that.
Oh yeah. So there's, I mean, I think the important thing to note is, right now a lot of the goal setting is sort of set it and forget it, and oftentimes setting it to 10,000 steps a day, and so there's not that much personalization going on with that, and so just as the sweet spot concept comes into play, I mean, that actually was partially also came about from some of the other goal setting work that my lab has been doing. This is more funded by National Science Foundation. But with the NSF work, one of the things that we did was we basically randomized a delivery of different step goals to someone's kind of ambitious but doable range, kind of a precursor to the sweet spot, if you will, but not necessarily for MS patients, for anyone, with like baseline median being the lower end up to 2.5 times that for some people. Long story short, what we've been finding actually is just having that variability, people have been loving it. They qualitatively, that has been like the thing. It was actually as part of our experimental design to build a dynamical model, because we just wanted to understand how, like, when we set a high goal and there's bad weather, what happens versus when there's good weather and stuff. So we needed that variability. But it so turned out that variability was actually really advantageous for us for adherence. And I mean, in hindsight, it makes a lot of sense. People just say, hey, it's fun. I don't know what I'm going to get every day. I don't know what I'm shooting for each day. And like every day is a surprise. And that surprise element in and of itself created something where people wanted to actually pay attention. Whereas once they got stabilized, if they got 10,000 steps a day, they no longer needed to talk, if you will. They no longer needed to interact with our system. And so they started to ignore it. This has happened in previous intervention strategies that I've had. So I think basically recognizing subtle elements of variability can probably be something that I think has been underappreciated within goal-setting strategies. But my intuition, based on at least our qualitative work, and we're now doing some more rigorous agile explorations into this concept. But the concept of utilizing variability to actually increase engagement is, I think, something that could be really advantageous. And then, of course, also building on Emil's point, also taking account of the data that they have, right? I actually think Jawbone has been doing a pretty nice job of this, where they do data history, and they're like, it seems like you've been walking this much on Mondays and whatnot, and so I think they've actually done some pretty nice work there. But I think there's that added feature of actually kind of building in that sort of a bit of an element of surprise could be something nice to work on.
Yeah, another thing that happens, I think, with some people is that they start internalizing goals, and I know the wearable makers probably don't like this, but the fact that people stop using them is not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, totally.
I've talked to people who've used heart rate monitors, and after a while, they know when it's too much, too little. They don't need the monitor anymore. My guess is some of that happens with some of these devices because that goal setting is becoming more of an internal process.
Yeah, and just to riff off of that a little bit, another way to think about the way that we think about it is every time we design a system, we want to be able to give more value compared to the burden we're placing on you for every single interaction. And you can imagine how if people are starting to internalize goals and whatnot, you ping them each morning and say, hey, how's your progress towards 10,000 steps a day? That's going to become more burdensome compared to the value you're giving to them. So.
Yeah, there's one more question. Your study points up limitations in current wearables in terms of being able to measure varied activities. In other words, not just heart rate or number of steps. How can wearables move ahead faster in measuring real-world activities or even individualized activities?
You see some of this happening with the device I just showed a minute ago. You can determine the type of activity that you're doing. There's presumably some sort of underlying algorithm that can pick up a pattern. I think the more able they are to detect activity levels with different activities, the more widely used they will be. We certainly found that in our study. We may have picked up some variability if somebody jumped in the water and went swimming one day, and that's perfectly good activity, but we had no way of monitoring. And I think instruments, devices are becoming more able to do that.
So, am I on? Oh, good. Okay, great. So I have just a couple questions, and I think we have maybe like about 5 more minutes left. I was wondering about, given kind of your experiences with this project, how you would think about kind of scaling up or generalizing to other chronic conditions and what those conditions would be, and also kind of other behaviors in other devices. So, for instance, there's more kind of medical devices like remote monitoring, like blood pressure and things like that. You also mentioned heart rate, but things that can, help people do adherence to medications and things like that. Just wondering if you I think this is it's a really interesting concept, and I'm wondering how you think about broadening it, if at all.
Yeah, I mean, so this is only one framework, and obviously there are other frameworks like heart monitoring. I also want to point out that some of the things that we did was sort of simplified assessments. So we just did steps, for example. But there are other using various algorithms with say heart rate, for example, and steps. We can have derived metrics like peak velocity and things like that, which might be more relevant in some cases. That's more around the computer variables, physical activity. With respect to other assessments like blood pressure recording, blood glucose monitoring, for example, I heard sometime back that there is an instrument that is in development, or if I'm not mistaken, it's already been developed, which is measuring blood glucose without doing a pinprick test. So that's something that, for example, diabetic population would find really helpful in terms of their tracking behaviors, especially because the initial dose adjustment period in diabetes requires a lot of, especially people who are on insulin, requires a lot of continual monitoring to figure out, what is the hypoglycemia versus hypoglycemic status. So I think using this framework would be very applicable in that situation as well. We have thought a bit about it, and we're actually internally doing some measurement mapping, other diseases as well, respiratory diseases where we're thinking of oxygen saturation. We're thinking of some of the spirometry reading, which is probably a bit more challenging because there's an educational component to that. You have to teach people how to breathe in, breathe out, and all that. But yeah, I mean that's some of the things that has been going on, and I think eventually we'll do that state. I don't know if you want to comment anything.
Best thing I can say is that after we did that one study, we had a number of other companies and groups approaching us about academic and commercial, different diseases, different measurements, and we tried to use the same basic format that we did last year in our pilot test. And we can share a but we're already realizing that we can't just sit on that. We have to think about how this applies to different metrics over different time spans, also with different designs. We would like to get into randomized control designs with this.
And I guess I can just briefly jump in on the more self-experimentation side. I mean, to me, the generalization of that is sort of how do you help people ask good questions about themselves? And there's a lot of questions that can be explored through these data. One of them is, for example, finding your sweet spot. But it really, to me, the interesting generalized concept of behavioral is trying to think through how do we help people, one, generate interesting questions that can be testable, but then two, generate a strategy to actually explore those. And so, we've been working on that in our lab. We've been focusing on kind of sleep as a behavioral target. That was what Google-funded work was. But there's other researchers who are working on this. For example, Julie Keynes at University of Washington is also playing around with these ideas. I know Bonnie Spring is increasingly getting intrigued with this idea at Northwestern. But I think the general question is still this idea of the generalizable concept is really how do you help people ask good questions about themselves so that they can continue to learn about themselves. And for that, I think that that is a general framework that can be put as was just highlighted by Emil and Punavesh, that can be highlighted a variety of different ways.
Great. Well, thanks to all three of you for joining us and presenting your work this morning. Great and thought-provoking presentation. Do you have anything to add, Alex?
Next webinar?
Yes, so we are in the process of scheduling our next webinar, which will be in January, which at a high level will be focused on these data kind of garnered from wearables and social networks, kind of general personal health data, and the extent to which, what are the issues around kind of representativeness of those data when we think about using it for kind of public good research. So what sorts of things should we be thinking about? And so we hope that you all will join us and spread the word, and there will be information forthcoming about the specific time and date of that. So thanks everybody for joining us, and thank you so much to our presenters, Punavesh, Emil, and Eric. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.